Today we're going to go over the Ecology Study Guide. So first we're going to go over the vocabulary matching. So number one, the vocabulary word is predation, and predation is E, an organism that hunts and kills another. Number two is mutualism, and mutualism is letter A, where both species benefit. Number three is parasitism, and parasitism is when one organism benefits by living on or in another organism, and the one that is lived in or on is harmed in the relationship, so that's letter B. Number four is commensalism, and this is where one organism is helped and the other is unaffected, so that's C. And number five is competition, and this is where two organisms are competing for the same resources, so they're using the same resources, so that's letter D. Number six is biotic, so these are the factors that are living, so like plants and animals, so that's letter D. Number seven is niche. The niche is the role or job of an organism in an ecosystem, so this is letter B. Number eight is abiotic, and these are the factors in an environment that are non-living, so like the weather, the temperature, the terrain, things like that, so that's letter E. Number nine is biodiversity, and this is the term that includes or describes the number of different species that live in an area. And so that's F, and remember, if something has high biodiversity, it has many species, and if something has low biodiversity, it has fewer species, and lower biodiversity usually means a less healthy ecosystem. Number 10 is habitat, and the habitat is the place where an organism lives, so that's letter A. And number 11 is the word biome or biomes, and remember that these are the major ecosystems that occur over a wide area of land, so that's letter B. We're going to move on to some more vocabulary with some fill-in-the-blank questions. So number 12 says, what term describes the total amount of living tissue in a trophic level? And the answer is biomass, right, which is the mass of all the living tissue. Number 13 says, what is the term for each step in a food chain or food web? And those are the trophic levels. So the trophic level indicates both what type of diet something has, generally speaking, and where it falls in the sequence of energy transfer through an ecosystem. Number 14 says a model of the complex feeding interactions in a community is, and the answer is food web. So food webs show the relationship between all of the different organisms and who eats what and how that energy is transferred from organism to organism. Number 15 says blank are at the base of all ecological pyramids, and those are the primary producers, right? Plants are the organisms that are able to capture energy from the sun and convert it to chemical energy, and so that's how that energy enters the trophic level chain or the food chain or the food web, and then it can be passed from plants to other organisms from there. Number 16 says animals that get energy by eating carcasses of other dead animals are called scavengers. So scavengers are organisms that don't necessarily hunt for their food, but they do eat other dead animals that have been killed from some other means. Number 17 says organisms that eat other animals are called carnivores. So the prefix carne means meat, so carnivores are meat eaters. So that would include, dogs, cats, wolves, things like that. Number 18 says plants, algae, and other autotrophs are considered, and those are producers. Remember, anything that is an autotroph and produces its own food by using energy from the sun is an autotroph. Number 19 says that animals that eat both producers and consumers are called omnivores. And so remember, any omnivore is going to be at least a secondary consumer, but it can use plants and animals in its diet. Number 20 says, what is another name for consumer? And that is heterotroph. So heterotrophs have to obtain their energy from other organisms. They are unable to do photosynthesis and obtain energy directly from the sun. And then number 21 says, what is the term for an organism that eats only plants? Those are herbivores. So herbivores are strictly animals that eat plant matter. They don't eat other animals. Number 22 says, how do primary producers make their own food? And that is through photosynthesis. So that's the name for the process where plants collect energy from the sun and convert it to chemical energy. Next, we're going to go through and label the trophic levels in the diagram. So we always start with the sun, right? That's where the energy comes from that drives life on Earth. And then the sun transfers energy first to producers. So you can label that with producers. And remember, they do photosynthesis in order to capture that energy. From producers, the energy goes to the primary consumers. Those are the herbivores in an ecosystem. And then from the primary consumers, we go to the secondary consumers. Remember that secondary consumers are carnivores, so they're generally going to eat the primary consumers. From secondary consumers, energy is transferred to the tertiary consumers. Remember, tertiary consumers are generally larger carnivores. They're capable of eating both secondary and primary consumers. And if any of those organisms die, they can all get broken down by decomposers. So recall that decomposers are things like worms, fungi, bacteria, all of those organisms that break down dead organic matter, and they can return it and return the nutrients from those dead things to the soil to return them to plants and make it through the whole food web again. Next, we're going to do some interpretation of the trophic levels. So we're going to answer a couple questions about this trophic level pyramid. So the first question, number 24, says blank percent of the energy contained in the mice is available to the snakes. So remember that second trophic level, that's where the mice are. They're the herbivores. And then they're going to transfer energy to the snakes, and that happens when the snakes eat the mice. And the amount of energy that's typically transferred is 10%. The rest of the energy that transfers from one trophic level to the next is generally lost to the environment as things like heat. So number 25, like we just talked about, says some of the rest of the energy is used up by the mice, but most is lost and it's lost to the environment as heat. Now we're going to review some of the cycles. So number 26 says what organisms are capable of nitrogen fixation. So if you recall, there's one organism that can take nitrogen from the atmosphere and convert it to a form that is usable by plants and animals. That process is called fixation, and it's carried out by bacteria. Number 27 says photosynthesis, burning fossil fuels, and decomposition of plants and animals are all part of and that is the carbon cycle. Carbon is found in all living things because we are what's considered a carbon-based life form, and so that means that any time something that used to be alive breaks down, it releases carbon to the environment. Number 28 says label the blanks in the water cycle below with the following words. So the vocabulary words we're going to use are condensation, evaporation, transpiration, groundwater, runoff, and precipitation. So first you'll notice that number 1 is pointing to the clouds, and that process is condensation, when water goes from being a gas as water vapor in the atmosphere to condensing so that we can see it in the form of clouds. Next, when we look at number 2, when water goes from being a cloud to falling to the earth, that process is called precipitation, and it can be rain, snow, sleet, hail, all of those different things are forms of precipitation. Number 3 is when water escapes from the leaves of plants and trees and things like that into the atmosphere as water vapor. That process is called transpiration, or sometimes evapotranspiration. When water makes it to the ground, one of the ways that it can move is through a process called runoff, where it travels across the surface of the earth and can run into bodies of water like lakes, streams, rivers, and oceans. Number 5 occurs when water goes from a liquid to a gas, and the name of that process is evaporation. And finally, number 6, when water is underground instead of on the surface, It's called groundwater, and water becomes groundwater often through a process called percolation. Part 4 is about succession. So number 29, the question says, what process is shown in the picture above? And you'll notice that you start out with something called a slough, and a slough is a wetland where there is some soil and some plants available, there's a lot of water, but there's not very many trees. And you can see that as time passes and it gets more and more mature, it becomes a forest with trees. So the process that is shown in this picture is called secondary succession. And the reason that it's secondary succession is because it starts with some place that has already had soil formation. Number 30 says, what is the climax community in the picture above? And the climax communities are the most mature, and so in this case, the climax community is the hardwood hammock. This is characterized by trees that are large, an understory of smaller trees, and probably some things growing on the ground. Then we're going to use this little word bank to answer questions 31 and 32. 31 says blank succession occurs after a lava flow. After you've had lava flow over an area, there's not going to be any soil or anything. It's just barren rock. So if that is where growth is starting from, that's called primary succession. If, on the other hand, someplace has already had soil develop, but then a disaster occurs, for example, like a forest fire, that's secondary succession. And secondary succession is a little bit different from primary succession simply because soil formation has already occurred, and so now it just needs new pioneer plant species to come in. It does not need to form soil from bare rock. Now we'll review some of the human impacts that we've talked about in ecology. So number 33 is skin cancer, and skin cancer can be increased because of the hole that has developed in the ozone layer. So that's C. And the reason that can happen is because the ozone layer helps to block ultraviolet light from reaching the surface of the earth, and ultraviolet light causes genetic mutations in things that are alive. And because our skin is the thing that's most exposed to the sun, the DNA in our skin cells can be changed if it comes into contact with ultraviolet light. Number 34 is CFCs, or chlorofluorocarbons. Chlorofluorocarbons can cause the thinning of the ozone layer, so that's letter E. And those are chemicals that we've used historically as refrigerants and coolants and things like that. And when they make it all the way up into the stratosphere where the ozone layer is located, it can break down the ozone and damage the ability to block ultraviolet light. Number 35 is global warming. So this is when the temperature of the globe has increased, and it can contribute to things like the rise in sea level. Because if the earth gets too warm, places that are historically frozen, like the poles and glaciers and ice caps and things, can melt, and that can cause the ocean level to go up a little bit, which can cause a lot of harm to coastal areas around the world. So number 35 is D. 36 is carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is the gas that's most responsible for global warming. So that's G. And we add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere anytime we burn things like fossil fuels. Number 37, poor farming practices. And so poor farming practices is when we leave topsoil exposed, for example, and that can cause a loss of topsoil. The Dust Bowl in the 1930s, for example, occurred because people removed a lot of vegetation that was in the grasslands in the western part of the United States. And when there was no plants to hold the soil there and the wind came along, it blew away the topsoil, which was really important for growing crops. And it also was very dry, and so that soil just blew across the country, and it did not stick around, and it caused a lot of issues for farming and food production for a couple of decades. So the answer to that one is B. Number 38 is acid rain. Acid rain occurs when sulfur and nitrogen compounds that have kind of been developed as exhaust during coal-fired power plant burning and things like that combine with water that's in the atmosphere in clouds, and then that precipitation that is now acidic can fall to the earth and cause damage to forests and to woodlands and to lakes and things like that. So acid rain is F. And then 39 is biological magnification. This occurs when the concentration of chemicals move up the food chain. So this is one of the things that nearly caused the bald eagles to go extinct earlier in the 20th century. And it's because these chemicals can become more concentrated as they move through trophic levels. So 39 is A. And finally, we'll just review the pH scale, because remember, pH is really important to homeostasis in things that are alive and the environments that they live in. So we can measure pH through the pH scale, and when you have a pH that is below 7, you have something that is an acid. When you have a pH of something that is 7, it is neutral. And when you have a pH of something above 7, it is a base.